From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Winnick. I'm the writer and editor at the American Folklife Center, and I'm here to welcome you to our Benjamin Botkin Folklife Lecture Series. Now, the lecture series provides a platform for professionals from both the academy and the public sector, as well as for colleagues working independently in folklore and related fields, to present findings from their ongoing research. And that's great for the public, of course, and we really hope that you enjoy today's talk. But they're also an important acquisitions project for us at the center because we get outstanding researchers like today's speaker in the field of folklife to tell us all about their research, and we record that on video, and that becomes part of the permanent collections of the library, and it also goes up on the library's website as a webcast. So, having said that, this is a good time to remind you to turn off your cell phones and other mobile devices so that your wonderful ringtones, which are so hip, do not get recorded for posterity and get listened to 100 years from now. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing a Botkin lecturer that we at the American Folklife Center know very well, and we hope that some of you know him too. Dr. Sean Burns is a Berkeley-based writer, teacher, and musician. His primary research interests are in the culture and history of left social movements, particularly questions of how movements generate transformative social imagination and translate that vision into effective local global initiatives. Sean also leads the popular indie folk rock band Professor Burns and the Lilac Field, and the University of Illinois Press recently published this wonderful book about Archie Green, which Sean Burns is here to talk to us about today. And I'll just mention that among the many other things Archie did as a folklorist was tireless lobbying of Congress in order to create the American Folklife Center. So all of us have a lot to thank Archie for, as well as to thank Sean Burns for coming and talking about him. So please welcome Sean Burns.
Thank you, Steve. A great honor to be here, and most importantly, to honor the life of work, vigilant, tireless, creative, humor-filled work that Archie did. It can't be a better day in terms of May Day to gather. In fact, I requested this day. Both, I think, we sort of know the red tradition of May Day, the history that goes back to the 1860s and the Haymarket martyrs and the importance that this day has taken on internationally for workers' struggles. This was Archie's favorite day. But I want to highlight the other facet of May Day too, the sort of long green history. A day which marks spring, a day which for centuries people celebrated nature's fecundity and vibrance and sustenance. And for Archie, his first love and fascination really was nature. He found himself walking in the hills of what's now Griffith Park as a youth, weekend after weekend, and his first kind of vocational calling was to be a forester. He actually went to thinking that he would study forestry, and it was the difficulty of math classes that sent him back to the humanities. And we're grateful for that, but I just want to point out he was really kind of in a very kind of intuitive way, felt really connected to nature, and as some of you know later on, wrote about and was kind of attuned to the way in which people were understanding the links between biological diversity and environmental conservation and its relationship to cultural plurality and cultural conservation. So May Day, in short, is a great day to be here. Let's see. I feel like the biographer's task varies tremendously depending on the subject matter. And for me, in terms of meeting and really falling in love, both intellectually and personally, with Archie Green, I came to see my task as, on one hand, bringing people into, in an intimate way, his presence. This is somebody who I felt was one of the great kind of conversationalists and orators of the United States of the 20th century. How could I bring people into that presence? I also felt that one of my tasks in terms of studying Archie Green was to illuminate the many Archies. What I found as I researched this man's life was that the many communities that he identified with and that he engaged with, they knew him most from that perspective. So specifically, well, many people kind of know this Archie that's pictured here. This is a man who was tremendously prolific and productive in his elder years, writing many books from that very room in San Francisco, speaking around the country tirelessly. But there are also, let's see, there we go. There are also people that knew Archie primarily as a worker, who was part of the building trades going back to 1941 when he joined the union in San Francisco as a shipwright. I love this picture, headed down Market Street. You see, he was excited to go to work, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. There were people who knew Archie primarily because they loved traditional music, and whether it was through reading his liner notes that he wrote throughout the 60s, or through the community of people that was pursuing vigorously early traditional recordings at this time period. This picture with Dorsey Dixon on one of the many trips that Archie made in the 60s to go find some of the people that had earlier recorded in the 30s, like Dorsey had. So the discographers, and the traditional folk music scholars, they knew Archie that way. Some people had the pleasure of knowing Archie as a teacher. This is the only picture I've ever seen of Archie teaching, and he didn't really identify himself as that, but as those of you who knew him can guess, he was quite dynamic in the classroom, and some of you, I believe, might have been students of his. It's safe to say that even though his years were few as a professional scholar and teacher, he impacted people tremendously in those years, and folks like Nick Spitzer, who wrote the afterword to this book, took his class on public folklore at Austin in the 70s. So some people knew him in that capacity. Some people knew him because he was a very inventive and an inspired kind of impresario of public folklore. And this is a great picture from the Smithsonian Folklife Festival 1969. That's Maybelle Carter, Doc Boggs, Merle Travis, Hazel Dickens singing Black Lung on the Mall in 69, and there's Archie Green looking on, really absorbed and really happy, it seems. As Stephen mentioned, perhaps Archie is best known because he lobbied tirelessly in the 70s for the passage of the American Folklife Preservation Act, which sort of paved the way for the center. Carl is here, and many of his images are in the book. I thank him for documenting these great shots. The folklorist Bill Wiggins, this is amazing because he's holding Archie's first book, Only a Miner in his arms, and you just get a sense for somebody like me who just heard stories about how creatively and passionately Archie lobbied in the 70s for the act, you just get a sense of how intense and engaging he was. And what I tell people in traveling around the country talking about this book is that he was successful knocking from door to door in the House offices, the Senate offices, because he actually had such a profound and kind of broad knowledge of U.S. folklore that he could engage people from every region of the country on the specificity of their own song, of their own, work cultures. So people across the aisle were convinced of this importance, and we're grateful for that successful work. This is a favorite image of mine that I found in Archie's basement slide of celebration of the passage of that American Folk Preservation Act a few years later. If you could, sort of with like Google world map, be honing in on this moment and scan the audience, you'd see President Carter and his wife casually sitting on the lawn of the White House listening to Archie talk. I think that this was also simultaneously a celebration of that stamp being released, organized labor. So it was a unique moment at the cusp of, Reagan's arrival. And so some people, as I'm saying, I'm just showing you this to give a sense of the kind of the multiplicity of Archie. This is another image by Malcolm Ronner taken in Archie's home of the award that he got from the library, the Living Legend Award, and he hung it on this Tin Man in his living room. The Tin Man was given to him by a sheet iron worker after Archie wrote his book on sheet iron workers. So that was special. He was a family man as well. This is a shot in Illinois of David, Derek, Luann, his daughter Deborah, and should be thought of in that light as well. I was really, Luann, I'm happy to say, is still with us. This is a couple months ago when the book came out. I went and visited Archie's wife, and this was a pretty special moment for me. She grabbed the book and just went right for the pictures, as anybody does. And that was, it was just, as those of you could guess that this project was born of years of us dialoguing in that living room, and I got to know Luann and the family. I have great gratitude to them. And so to share this with Luann was really special. For those of you who don't know Archie, he passed in 2009 in the midst of this research project. So to share with his wife was special. And I'll close this part by saying that's Archie and I. That's actually shortly before the laborlore conversation that was here. And I remember that because his eyes were hurting. He could barely open his right eye. But I show this picture not to, it means a lot to me, but mostly to symbolize the amazing generosity of this man throughout his life, share what he knew with so many peers and youngsters. That commitment to be a public intellectual and to mentor so many is at the heart of his magic. And I want to now, before getting more kind of like formally talking about his work and his legacy, I wanted to bring you all who hadn't got a chance to meet Archie, or those of you who have, into his home by showing you a short film that I'm really happy my friend and I made in the year before Archie passed. And after that film, I think it will be that much richer to say a few more words and then begin dialoguing with you all about some of the themes of workers' folk life that Archie focused on.
to understand how a ship is under construction, you have to think from the inside out, or you have to think backwards. See in your mind's eye the forms that are going to hold. The way a sculptor looks at a chunk of granite and he can see a shape of a beautiful girl in the granite, and he liberates his job is to liberate the girl out of the granite, and in a sense the shipwright is liberating the steel or the shape of the ship out of the raw material.
Shades of the iron masters of old, listen to your hammers stamping the steel discs of the jet.
Come on in. Some of the things that I say to you one day, I can't recapture them because I'm not reading a script. This is a sort of example of James Joyce's free association of composition as images come to the surface and as memory works. And I'm sure I said something like that, but on some of it you're going to have to fill in. Getting a job, it was so wonderful, and it was the start of being a class-conscious worker. You know, in America, everyone is supposed to always go up, advance, but in this case, it's déclassé, it's going down. But I didn't think I was going downhill. I thought that being a worker was, as I said before, it was a combination of Paul Bunyan and John Henry. It was romantic, it was strong. No one in my family had ever worked in a shipyard. You know, it would have been in Pittsburgh, steel and autos, Detroit, you know, but in San Francisco it was a waterfront. So I went down to Western Pipe and Steel. It was in South San Francisco, at Brisbane. And the journeyman met me in the tool house and said, "Follow me." And we went up I'd never been that high on the side of a ship. That's, 30 or 40 feet, and you go from stages they're about every 8 feet, and you clamber up. Finally you get there, and the guy that's leading you disappears, or if he's a journeyman, he's at some phase of the work. Now he would be inside the fantail. Well, as I remember it was indescribable. It would represent a kind of a jungle because it was a closed space. First, you don't understand it. It's bewildering, almost beyond comprehension. There's always things going on. Welding, burning to burn the steel, and there's chipping guns that are like riveting. Welding it's dangerous to the eyes to look at the weld. Burns the eyeballs. The fumes are very dangerous. They're poisonous. I remember the first job, the journeyman, I think maybe might have been Parsons. He told me to get some fish plates. I had never worked in the shipyard. I didn't know if he meant a plate that held barracuda or tuna, it just, and I didn't ask him because you don't want to reveal your ignorance on the first day. Somehow someone told me what a fish plate was, and how would I get them? They're down in the hold. It's kind of scary. It's like going down into a cavern, and went down about 3 levels and found a lot of fish plates, and filled up a gunny sack, and carried it over to the hold and started to climb the ladder, and then I fell. These incidents came every day. That when you worked, you worked 1 week, that was a victory. Going to work on the first day, being aware that you're on a payroll and that you're in a working class situation, maybe that's a moment of epiphany. But from then on, it rains a lot. In the morning the steel is wet, the scaffolding is wet, and it's dangerous. And a normal person would ask, why not work in an office? Why not work in a university where you don't have to do a goddamn thing but stand up in front of a bunch of lazy students and bullshit? That's what a professor does. And that's why I used to tell, and still do, I told you I have friends that they ask me what I am, and I say a shipwright. Being a shipwright was being part of an old and honorable craft. Noah was, we knew that who was the first shipwright? Noah in the Bible. There's a line in Hamlet where Hamlet's talking to the gravedigger, and he's holding the Horatio's skull or someone's skull, and he said, who builds stronger than a carpenter? And the answer is a shipwright.
I'll get to this letter in a second, obviously of importance to this series. Let me just say this. The film, of course I wanted to share it with you because it brings you in to my experience of talking in Archie's living room and experiencing the particular kind of magic of and intensity of how he spoke about history, about how he spoke about his life, and how he understood a really enormous wide range of topics. But I also, as that comic moment highlights, while he lived such a long life and did so many things, writing multiple books and teaching and lobbying, as he says, when people ask what he did, he answers, I was a shipwright, I was a worker. That was in terms of literally his time on the docks, it was a very short period of time in his life, mostly because after the war, that work disappeared in San Francisco. They had some time of converting those ships back to recreational use, but then he became what he called an uptown carpenter into the 50s. And yet he identified so strongly with that. Well, so one of my challenges, to go back to some of the things I said in the beginning, was in a man who lived so long and who did so much, like what could I begin to capture in a biographical study? And I decided that the best thing I could do was to sort of look at his political and intellectual development, his formation. And that is both because of themes that were coming up after I met him in terms of our dialogues, but also because I came to the table with a history as a social movement scholar. And the question for me, one of them that had fascinated me for a long time, is like, well, what are the experiences that shape our political and social imagination? And how does that imagination transform over time? Through what kinds of experiences? So the challenge for me was to place Archie within a particular historical context, to understand his commitment to workers' folk life in light of, what over time became very apparent to me, the kind of ethos and cultural context of the Popular Front, Cultural Front, or what Michael Denning calls the age of the CIO. So let me read you this quote from a book that was definitive for me. This is Michael Denning's book, The Cultural Front, and I'll segue into this letter. Michael Denning argues this. He says, the real story of the Cultural Front in the age of the CIO is the story of modern forms of political struggle within state agencies and cultural institutions. Part of the work of that text that the quote comes from is to sort of redefine and expand our sense of what the Popular Front was. And I read that quote because, of course, two people that best exemplify what he's saying, the story of political struggle within state agencies and cultural institutions. I mean, that's Benjamin Botkin, that's Archie Green. Botkin was of inspiration to Archie. He's one of a kind of community of public intellectuals that Archie looked up to, and of course they became friends. And I highlighted this moment in this letter where Botkin says, I, however, see the broadening of the concept of folklore as part of the function of folklorists to keep pace with the changing role of the folk and folklore audience and the dynamics of cultural change and cultural strategy and democracy. I mean, for those of you who know the history of public sector folk life, where you get a sense like that commitment to understanding the project in broader terms was contentious, and not everybody agreed with Botkin, not everybody agreed with Green, but they are similar in that respect. And I want to tell you, segue now to a specific example of how Archie Green sort of pressed the envelope and expanded people's conception of what folk life was. Let me begin by reading from, these are minutes from Senate hearings. This is in 1970. I found this here through the National Archive. This is the beginning of Archie's work to pass the American Preservation Folklife Act, one of the early hearings where he's in dialogue with the great Texas liberal Senator Yarborough. Now, they've been having a discussion about the similarity between this moment in 1970 and the 30s. This is, there's so much I wanted to read and share with you today, but I gotta just take excerpts because of time. This is Archie Green saying, I can't help but think in coming from a campus a week ago, that would be Illinois where he was teaching at the time, 1970, coming from a campus a week ago where students were on strike, of the analogy between the 1930s and the 1970s. I'm convinced to the very depth of my soul that your legislation bears the same relationship to current events that Senator LaFollette's legislation bore to the traumatic experiences of the 1930s. Senator Yarborough responds, well, I can't help but be old enough to remember the 1930s. I can't help but remember that in those days it was the blue-collar workers who were being shot down, and in these days students at universities are being shot down, and blue-collar workers have shown little sympathy. So they go on to, in a sense, they start having a conversation about a moment that I think sort of captured national media at the time, which was construction workers, hard hats in New York, beating down students in the streets. So fast forward later to the dialogue. So they've been talking about this contention between workers' movements and students. Later in the dialogue, Green says, if we are going to heal American society in a figurative sense, folklorists can act as physicians and surgeons. Folklore is a substance that is inexpensive. It is the only substance I know of that is inexpensive and readily available. It serves as a bonding and binding force. I can think of no other substance in American life that can bring blue-collar people and students together, that can bring black and white together, rich and poor, north and south. It seems to me that this is the challenge in technological society. How do you counter the forces of machinery? How do you keep society from being completely polarized? Very specifically, the challenge in New York City, it seems to me, is to restore to trade unionists some sense of their own tradition. When you look at the level of folk festivals, when you work at the level of folk research, it's not just a matter of the barrel maker or the arrow maker or the five-string banjo picker. We literally need to bring some of the New York building tradesmen down to the Washington Mall with their skills, and we have to involve them in the festival movement. That's 1970. See, it's not responding now. Okay, that's 1970. So here's 1971, what I argue is a sort of pivotal moment in public history and labor lore, when Archie convinced Ralph Rinzler to expand his own sense of what the Smithsonian Folklife Festival should be about and create the Working Americans exhibit. And here you can see building trades folks with the Washington Mall in the backdrop, as I say in the book, kind of building an alternative monument. And the Washington Post, in an article that I quote in the book, sort of notes how unusual it was to see that go up amidst the mall. And it may be small text, but these workers from all over the country gathered for that week, and there were some other images that showed them engaging with the audiences in the mall. And so I hold this out as a great example of what Botkin was talking about in his letter, and of Archie's own work to kind of expand what we understand as folk life. I kind of feel like I had so many documents I wanted to share, and I knew that a crowd like this would appreciate it. It's a little bit like sitting around at the living room showing you cool stuff. Archie had close to 100 feet of personal papers in South Carolina, in North Carolina. This was just, I highlighted that point. This is a letter from Roger Abrams a little bit earlier. He says, you remember our discussion after my talk at Penn when you said in your gravest manner that folklorists never have a chance to investigate their intellectual backgrounds, the intellectual background of the study of folklore. They're trying to get this talk off. If you skip down to the bottom of the letter, those are names that are probably familiar to a lot of you. John Schwed, Alan Dundas, who was out at Berkeley. So this is part of the moment, and Archie's work fits importantly in there. Okay, so let me say to you, open up the last topic of today. Here was my greatest challenge in doing this work. When I met Archie, of course he was late in life, and he was 88 at the time. And what I began to identify was that the themes that mattered so much to him, he was expressing them in a very distilled way at that point in his life. And he would hammer on the same topics again and again to me and others. Those topics had really two themes that I want to share today. He would talk a lot about the Communist Party and his hatred of the party. This was new for me because as a social movement scholar, I mean, you just didn't see much on the tradition of left anti-communism. Of course, we're well aware of the tradition of conservative critiques of the Communist Party in this country, but I just had not been that aware of left anti-communism. So that's something I began to explore. The other theme, and then I'll link them together, was that he talked quite passionately about the difference between the sort of traditional folk music that he advocated and the more popular folk traditions that owed their origins to the very communist kind of influenced Popular Front period in the 30s. So, and I just thought, in both of these topics, I thought to myself, God, this stuff went on so many years ago. How could this guy at 88 be so emotionally, viscerally wrapped up with this? Well, in part it was my naivete, but in part it was like, that's where I needed to go. And here's what the essence of my argument is in the biography, is I say, to understand Archie Green's the themes that and passions that animated his life, that defined his focus on folk, the folk life of workers, laborlore, that meant understanding him as an intellectual whose formation was in this earlier era. Well, that would seem, kind of obvious in some light, but because he lived so long, and because he entered the academy and became a professional folklorist after so many decades as a worker, and he wrote prolifically in the 1980s and 1990s, it kind of obscured his identification with this much earlier era of intellectuals. So let me just throw up a few intellectuals from that era that I think we need to understand Archie as a kind of community member with. Archie being born in 1917. When you think about something like C. Wright Mills, I mean, I just, that in my mind, going to grad school in the last 10 years, I mean, that's a long time ago when C. Wright Mills was, or Raymond Williams, or to think like, wait a sec, Archie's older than E.P. Thompson and Herbert Gutman? And I'll come back to why those individuals are so important. Now, the difficulty of casting Archie in this period is both sort of intellectual, but also in terms of being in dialogue with Green when he was alive, was that he did not want to be associated with this era, precisely because this era conventionally is so understood as closely relating to the Communist Party, right? It's sort of our understanding typically of the Popular Front and of the Cultural Front is so linked to the party. Archie did not, want that kind of affiliation personally, but precisely my argument in the book is we need to understand that era in broader terms. And to think about Archie Green and place him in that era, to think about how that era lived on in sort of long ripples, infusing his work and stimulating the questions that he wrote about for decades, stretches our understanding of the Popular Front. So that's part of kind of the tricky navigation that I was doing, and it was okay for us to differ on that. So let's see. I'm not going to have time to go through this, but I was going to then, basically what I wanted to argue is that to understand how he stretched the conception of folk life at the time is to understand his particular individual history and the themes of that era. That's Archie as a young boy. Let me just stay on this slide for a second. That's his father and grandfather. He dedicated his first book to Samuel, his father, on his side there. And that dedication reads, I want to get it exactly right here, "For whom the skills of head and hand are one." If there was one thing that I felt like was common between Archie's work and some of the work of other Popular Front intellectuals, it was that they were rethinking the categories of worker and intellectual by virtue of the rise of the age of the CIO. I think for me, Archie was very interested in Gramsci. That was somebody that I had studied. It was someone who we could engage around. And that is a central category and project for Gramsci too, to reconceive and conceptualize what the worker and the intellectual and how the two come together. So that dedication of only a minor to his father saying, for whom the skills of head and hand are one, is important in that light. This is a sweet shot of Archie before he went to war with Luann, his wife, so many decades. This was a great document to find. In 1956, he's still a carpenter. He's, and that's the building trades paper celebrating San Francisco carpenter helps preserve labor's history and lore. The California Labor School, that picture of him earlier, which the FBI later questioned him about his involvement in. This is 1958. Again, Archie has not entered professional folklore work yet, but I just wanted to give you a sense that these are the kinds of documents I've come across in his personal papers. Page Stegner, the son of Wallace, they're in the car together in San Francisco, crossing the bridge to go to Berkeley. And John Newhouse, an amazing longtime wobbly, really a man who previous to Archie studied the Little Red Songbooks more than anybody and had an amazing collection of them, and he gave them to Archie, and that kind of launched his Big Red Songbook project. But this is Page writing down the lyrics to that wobbly song in the car as John Newhouse sang him a year before John died, the DeHorn song. So kind of a precious document indicating Archie's quest. This is, I think, a really special letter. This is 1956, Archie writing to Pete Seeger. And what's special about it is he's been in the trades for all these years, but he's yearning for more. I mean, what I see is at this period, he wants to find a way to express his hobby, his love of workers' songs, his love of workers' tales. And he's describing to Pete that background. And in case you can't read it, I just want to read this middle section. By way of introduction, may I state that I've put in my apprenticeship on the San Francisco waterfront. I've served as a secretary of the Shipyards, Joiners, and Boat Builders Union before entering the Navy. I'm currently employed as a carpenter in building construction. Books and records are my hobby. The challenge I have set for myself is to compile a descriptive checklist of American labor and work songs on records. If it is possible, I want to draw from the fields of folk, country western, pop, blues, and other musical forms to tell the stories of workers and their industries. I've begun with coal miners and stevedores and hope to go on to lumberjacks, the needle trades, textiles, etc. So already in 56, I mean, the themes that he explores in 1972 and Only a Miner, those are already present. He's trying to link together workers' history and workers' cultural life in a way that nobody had done yet. And the reason why he's thinking to do that is because he's been for almost 30 years in the Union Hall. He's been on the docks. He's seen how profound and how diverse workers' cultural expression is, and he's reading labor history by moonlight. I mean, I don't know how he slept in these years with all those kids as well, but it was just important for me to kind of see him articulating at this time. Fast forward a little bit, this is, in 1960, he goes out to Illinois and gets his first position working in the library at Illinois. Many of you know Richard Dorson, Dick Dorson, that he's writing this letter to, the preeminent folklorist at the time. This last paragraph that I highlighted, I love that. This is 1962. He says, if I stay with the rebels, the hillbillies, the coal miners, the lint heads, and the discographers, I'll be busy for a lifetime to come. Prophetic statement, because for the next 50 years, he was very busy sticking with those characters and telling their tales. This is actually the last image, and I'll use it to go back to a theme, and then we can open it up to some conversation. This is Pete writing Archie in 63. At this point, Archie's kind of getting his name out there. Hillbilly Source and Symbol was in the Folklore Journal. He had been emceeing folk festivals. His liner notes were getting around. Pete and Archie, to put it in context, they're writing back and forth, and Pete's saying, write an article for Sing Out. What's wrong with you? Why won't you do it? Right? He says there, I'm writing because I wonder if you are still scared to do an article for Sing Out. Well, I can just summarize here his response to that. It didn't come for some years. He basically ignored Pete for a while. But when he wrote him back finally after more letters that looked like this, he said, scared? And he tells this story of look, he talks about his involvement in the Navy in World War II, his, surviving the maritime politics in the early 40s in San Francisco. He's like, these are things one could be scared of. Writing for Sing Out. So as many of you know, the bigger story going on here is that Archie did not approve of the particular emphasis of Sing Out in terms of the kind of music that they promoted, although that's kind of a simple characterization. So what I had, to go back to this question, I had to understand why did a man who, as good as anybody, could understand the kind of intellectual problem with marking a certain folk song as authentic, as pure in a sense. This is a person who, with his historical depth and with his understanding of contemporary theory, could say, yeah, it's more complicated than that. Everything, like he said, is sort of an onion that could be peeled layer upon layer of previous traditions. And what I argue in the book is that, well, he would mark things authentically folk because it fit into a larger political project of advocacy for those people and their traditions. And so, for him, although, and this is a longer story, but I'll just hint to it, for Archie, he would say about Joan Baez, about Dylan, of course, about Seeger, he'd say, look, ultimately their politics will be so less important than the negative impact that their style has made on American popular culture. What he means by that is a kind of popularized style that he would call pablum, beat down grain, so that everybody could have an ear for it. Whereas he'd rather hear, Hazel Dickens sing out Black Lung on the Washington Mall, like we saw earlier, in that sharper, regional twang. I mean, the quest for me was to understand, well, he partly had those strong perspectives because he had been on the docks in the 30s and 40s where your relationship to particular parties could have meant life or death. So it was to understand his critique of the cultural politics of the Popular Front back then that continued to inform and color his take on the more contemporary folk music at the time of people like Dylan and Joan, that he identified with that history. So that was part of what I had to just go into and disentangle and make an argument about, because I disagreed with him about that, about the quality of the music of people like Pete and of their impact on American culture. I disagreed with him about those things, but as many of you know, I mean, part of why he got so much done was that he was willing to work with people that he had significant ideological differences with, and I respected that, and I'll just say in closing, part of what I had to do too was understand, like, on one hand, this is a man who self-identified as an anarcho-syndicalist. I went into his home for the first time and saw a wobbly charter of a local bakery in San Francisco. But he wasn't at the barricades, in the way you might imagine a lifelong radical syndicalist. No, I mean, he was in the halls of Congress, right? How did somebody, if you thought about traditional kind of conceptions of syndicalism, an anarchist, somebody who identifies as an anarchist like he did, how many anarchists that I know are lobbying Congress lately? I mean, this is this, to me, that's was something that my generation could learn from. That kind of political complexity and a kind of pragmatism that didn't mean moving to the center, but meant facility to act in many different circles intelligently and actively. So I'll just close with that, because let's dialogue for a little bit. I know some of you have to go soon, and that's fine, and some of you can stay, but so I'm happy to take some questions, and I guess I'll stay behind the mic so that for recording purposes, but anybody? Yeah, Steve.
I'll start with a comment, and then I'll ask a question, but the comment is that I was telling Sean about some of the changes that we've had in the Folklife Center recently, about how our director retired and the head of our archive retired, and David, who was the head of research and programs, moved over to a new job in library services. So our whole management essentially, left at once. He said, "Oh well, Archie was a syndicalist. He would have said, you don't need those clowns anyway," which is neither here nor there. But,
yeah.
But I wanted to ask a question, because you showed a wonderful list of the public intellectuals and the intellectuals who were contemporary, or roughly so, with Archie. And one of the first ones was Americo Paredes.
Yeah.
And that's someone who's really interesting in the history of folklore, and of course in the history of Chicano studies and Mexican American studies. And they had a lot in common in terms of some of their, like the native intellectual, who were the intellectuals among the workers on the one hand and the Mexican American community on the other. Did they communicate a lot? Did they work together at all? A
little bit. When Roger Abrams, very importantly and generously, at a time I think when Archie was a little bit confused personally and professionally, he brought Archie down to Austin. And so America was still there. It wasn't extensive, but I know he had a lot of respect for him. And I know that, at that time one of the amazing documents I found was his syllabus from 1975, Archie's first public folklore course that Nick was in, that Deborah Kodish was in, I think Paula Johnson was in. This is a course that, like I said, it was unprecedented. It was a 25-page syllabus. It started back, like 300 years ago. It showed just the amazing kind of historical imagination and intellectual imagination he had. I mean, of course, there's a lot of themes that are coming up for me that I wanted to share today. Let me just say this. As somebody who was studying labor history personally when I met Archie, and of course, given my age, that would mean I was studying labor history that was deeply influenced by the turn toward new labor history in the 70s and 80s. And I realized to myself, like, you guys, this is something I want to say to you all, that so many of you are folklorists. I'd been in the humanities and social sciences doing interdisciplinary work for almost 20 years. I don't think I really ever heard the word folklorist for 10 years before meeting Archie. And then, of course, because of this project, I started meeting people like yourselves and others all around the country. And I said, God, I love this community. And I recognize their values and their work is so central to what matters to me and other people in my disciplines. And particularly in terms of understanding labor history and its journey, I realized, God, no wonder. Well, I said, in terms of labor history, if you are going to start taking more seriously the culture of workers in the workplace, well, it's no wonder you look to folklorists. Because they're the people who have been doing that for a long time. And so part of what I argue is that Archie is celebrated by public folklorists, but he needs to be, I argue, more central to our understanding of how new labor history has evolved, to American studies. I mean, he needs to be in those historiographies of those disciplines. And the fact that he isn't, kind of reveals, I think, it's just a sort of a blindness to the importance of the field in general of folklore and its impact on sort of the cultural turn within the larger humanities. And, the way in which, like, I was a student of Jim Clifford's at UC Santa Cruz, and his particular theorizing of ethnography, but you all were wrestling with that in deep ways in those eras too. Yeah, Guha.
Just to follow up on a question that Steve raised, one of the things I think that drew Archie and American Paredes together was not just a concern for representation. American Paredes would say Chicanos and Mexican Americans, and Archie with working people and radicals and wobblies and so on in the kind of public sphere. But they were precisely held together intellectually because just when you hear that film of yours where Archie's quoting, for instance, Hamlet and Joyce, and there he is, at the same time, able to talk to Dorsey Dixon on the mill floor in North Carolina. American Paredes was not just, getting things, words and whole images and scenes of history from people that he worked with on the border. He was one of the most erudite scholars of Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
That Texas had known, which none of the old boys, when they hired him in 1960 whatever, 62, ever couldn't fathom that there was a guy who basically grown up in the shadow of the border, could be a better than Shakespearean scholar than these folks who have gone through these prep schools and all of that. So and I found a couple of those letters in the UNC archives going back and forth between America and Archie. But I wanted to forward back to the intellectual question was, that's interesting that you mentioned, I don't know what your depth of the conversation was in terms of his intellectual forebears, and this sort of maybe casts a light on his relationship with the Popular Front. I always come back to the famous exchange between E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams, where Raymond Williams argues for, in the post, sort of in the fall from grace with the Soviets, he argues for culture as a whole way of life. And E.P. Thompson immediately slaps him down and says, no, culture is a whole way of struggle. And I wondered if that had a kind of resonance, and as you're talking about the various conversations you had.
Yeah, I mean, that, for me, I devote the end to that very theme. And basically saying, in part, it's a critique of business unionism is what I get at. Because I say, in a kind of creative way, I say, once the sort of battle of union life was thought of as taking place at the collective bargaining table in the boardroom, where was the room for culture any longer in the union struggle? And that's a way of critiquing that particular turn and saying, hey, we need to broaden out and and culture is such a vital battlefield. And for me, part of what was powerful, I mean, being my age, all of my teachers were from the New Left. I didn't have contact with anybody from the Old Left until I met Archie. I mean, my grandparents either had died or weren't political. So this was part of the profound relationship. That I said, I dropped my other dissertation project a couple weeks after I met Archie and said, I got to do this guy's story. And in part because of that connection. And what I realized is, well, one of the beautiful things of that era of Archie and his contemporaries is that there was amazing intellectual work that was happening outside of the academy. Journalists like Carrick McWilliams or Louis Adamek stand out to me. And that, to me, that's important for my generation too, and I think is what is happening again, in part because the academy is in the crisis that it is, a crisis of imagination and crisis of wallet. But the difference that it makes for people for intellectuals to circle through the variety of communities that people like Americo and Archie did is profound for the questions that they ask, for their analysis, the difference that makes for, in a sense, like what I think is the core question of the social sciences is like, what counts? What counts as being worthy to unfold into our inquiry, and what counted for Archie, like he said, is like that's what compelled him to bring these workers to the mall. And so I think that commitment to the tenacity to do your work and reinvent oneself like Archie had to over his life, and to to not think that the only place that you could get good intellectual political work done was the university. I mean, he just didn't identify with the university at all, even though he could have continued with that tenure track job. That's inspiring to me. And I think in some sense too, I want to definitely, one of the great stories, like I had a chance to meet Utah Phillips, before he passed, and he told me this story, a great wobbly story that kind of culminated with that wobbly line, "We build the ship even though we know we may never sail it." And Archie, he had, that kind of wobbly perspective of commitment to building cultures of resistance, even though, with no guarantees, right? That's kind of the great way to put it. Politics with no guarantees. I mean, he completely inspired me on that level, and I know many of you as well. And that's, that's the call of the moment. I know he's smiling with what's happening today on May Day, and the kind of reinvigorated sense of imagining, another world as possible, in the boldest sense. Any last question or? Yeah, Saul.
At the end of the film, there was a picture of a crane. Is that the Copra crane? And can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Copra crane. Copra referring to coconuts. That is one of the last symbols of the centrality of longshore work in the Bay Area, and Archie's work with other historians and laborers, longshoremen, ILWU folks, to preserve that crane, and not just, let's say now we've got the America's Cup coming to San Francisco and like remake the shoreline in light of that event, but and to kind of just to preserve the presence of the past in that kind of way was important to him. And I'll say that in terms of how he went about work of like preserving that crane, well, he built a coalition with environmentalists who were trying to rejuvenate the ecology of the creek that the crane is adjacent to. you know. And again, that's a sensibility that now is kind of like, thankfully, sort of like in the air we breathe. Like youngster organizers I'm around, like they get that. But that was, you know, for somebody in their 80s, right? That's profound. That was awesome to learn about that and to see him work in those ways. That kind of chameleon and facility and agility. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So why didn't he bring his own perspective and all his years of research to Sing Out? Why did he? You had this editor and a friend and longtime activist himself.
Yeah.
Seeger, so this lion. Why didn't he see that as an opportunity to bring his perspective to people who wouldn't have it?
Yeah.
Why exclude yourself into this purist corner?
I know. Well, in one sense, it's like one of the sad histories and legacies. That sectarianism of the left is part of it. I mean, I wasn't politicized in that kind of climate.
I mean, he said he's still battling about the CP like in his late 80s. I mean, hello, Pete Seeger. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, he clearly understood Seeger's, Communist Party
Yeah.
fealty.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
throughout this period, and I don't know if you ever talked about that, but probably he had something of a chip on his shoulder about him.
Yeah.
They were civil with each other.
Was Sing Out a communist?
Not directly. Erwin, there's. Yeah. Well, here's a great example. I found later the Royces did an interview with Erwin Silber, who was the longtime editor of Sing Out, right? And in the interview, they're basically getting at this question that, like, well, like from Archie's perspective or other Trotskyists, he would project this characterization of CP members like robots to the Kremlin. I mean, we're talking about American communists that, from Archie's perspective, we're just taking their cue from higher ups in a way that I disagree with. I mean, there's such great work by people like Robin Kelly and Maurice Isserman and other communist historians that show, like, of course, people exercised independence and agency within that party, and it wasn't as top down and undemocratic somebody like Archie portrayed it as. I mean, I personally feel like, well, the party did some very important, vital things for our history. So I guess it's what Erwin Silber says is like, you kidding me? Like, it wasn't. You think that Communist Party higher ups were telling us to go get the folk singers and bring them in and make that unity between the party and he's like, no way. They weren't paying attention to it at all. This is, in a sense, it's like, I mean, part of what I say in the book is like, look, that relationship between the left and folk music, we may understand it as particularly congealing through Communist Party organizing and relationships, but we can also think about like Harry Smith collecting his archive in Seattle, or I mean, there's other kinds of legacies that lead into that moment and that affiliation. And if you're interested in these topics, there's a lot more written. I signed a bunch of these books out there. Really, please, if you want, take one home and I get into it in more detail, which is hard here, but
having said that, though, it's also true that later on, Pete has said that he regrets that he wasn't more outspoken against Russian communism, and particularly Stalin, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that although there wasn't any direct, the Communist Party wasn't saying you may not criticize Stalin, people still weren't doing it within the movement, just because they felt, it created a sort of ideological, disconnect, and so that was sort of, and so Archie had some, possibly, had some feelings there, and had some reason for not wanting to be associated with that movement, possibly. So.
Well, the other irony is that Seeger, of course, ended up attacking Dylan from the kind of what you want to call the
Yeah.
depending on how you want to put it, either the hidebound or the organic aesthetic left.
Yeah.
And so they say, hey, you're selling out, and then meanwhile, Archie Green is lumping them in the same kettle of fish, as it were, in the same fish plate, saying, look, you guys are both sellouts to the real, organic, authentic, moment, in the culture.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I'm going to ask you a question that I'm going to find the answer to on May 20th when the book is published. But as you talk, it's easier for me to draw a parallel between Archie Green and a teacher of mine who was A.L. Lloyd. I studied with Lloyd in the early 80s. I was his last student. Bert Lloyd went out on a whaling ship. He worked on a sheep shearing farm in Australia. His intellectual development did not occur within a university setting, and his first gigs as a musician were in the workingmen's clubs in England. And I wonder how much those two were in touch with each other, these two, Archie Green and Bert Lloyd, who had so much in common in their respective countries.
I believe that the term industrial folk song was Lloyd's, and Archie knew that, and kind of in later, in letters in the 60s, recognized his work, but he's not somebody that I knew that from speaking with Archie that he was talking a lot about, but I know that there's a file for sure on some letters that they had exchanged, and like I said, and I acknowledge it in the book, is saying like he picked up on that, because a lot of what was happening is like sort of terminology about what these songs were, and
and Lloyd wrote "Come All You Bold Miners."
Yeah.
Edited and collated.
So yeah, the influence is there. I wanted to say, for example, and this goes back to kind of this theme that we're circulating around, Archie rejected this term "people's songs," which was a common phrase in the popular front. And what sort of work did that term do? Well, what it did is it was a way for people to get around this distinction of being an authentic folk singer or a performer of folk songs. It's like, if we just call them people's songs, we're all doing those. So, he didn't like that, and he, in fact, what he did was he stuck with the term vernacular music. And there's a great, one of the points of the book that I'm sort of proudest of is I'm arguing about sort of why Archie held on to this term vernacular music, and he actually did some research. Where did that term come up? Aaron Copland used that word for the first time in a review of Rock the Cradle. What's the Cradle? Yeah, The Cradle Will Rock, the 1937 Mark Blitzstein musical, and it's described as like a brilliant sort of capturing of vernacular music. Aaron Copland saying that about the play, and Archie, he couldn't stand the play, right? He says, vernacular music, if it was vernacular music, it would have had, Polish and Slavic polkas in it. This was avant-garde inspired, Bertolt Brecht modernism, proletarian opera, like his. So I go into like, that helps his critique of that play, for example, which is still embraced. I remember they did a rerun of that play at Left Forum like 2 years ago in New York, and I was like, wow. Well, that's when I was doing research. I thought, so him teasing that out or rejecting people's songs as a category. Like I said, like I have my own differences with it, and I get what you're saying and asking that, and then and we place it in this bigger history. And on one hand, it's like, okay, I can't argue with the guy. I wasn't navigating the battles between Harry Bridges and Harry Lundberg's unions in '39 on the docks. So that's the trick. That's the work, the complexity. Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you.
Total pleasure. Total pleasure.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.